In order to understand why Hitler killed Ernst Röhm, we need to go back a little bit to the end of the First World War. When the Russian Revolution occurred from 1917 onwards, millions starved, the economy collapsed, the people were suppressed under a brutal regime, and revolutionaries across the world realised that something had gone wrong. This was why, when the Social Democratic Party of Germany got into power in 1918, one of the first things that their socialist leader, Friedrich Ebert, declared to the German people was that they would not make the same mistakes as the communists had in Russia. He said the SPD were there to protect the German people from civil war and famine and to achieve its just demands for self-determination. The socialist community of Europe eventually learned that after the Soviets had nationalised all firms with 5 or more employees, industrial production ground to a crawl under their bureaucratic and administrative weight. As the ruble collapsed, shortages became chronic and raw materials almost impossible to secure. Worst of all, tens of thousands of workers and engineers fled to the countryside in search of food. By 1920, foreign trade had virtually ceased, and industrial production had fallen to a small fraction of its pre-war quantity. One source calculated that by 1921, industrial output was only 18% of its 1916 level. By 1922, it was only 27% of pre-war levels. Moreover, by 1921, wages for city workers had plummeted an estimated 2/3 in just 3 years. Lenin could no longer brag about his communist worker state, since there were almost no workers employed in the Soviet Union. Well, due to the failure of communism, the majority of socialists across the world became soft to the idea of a violent revolution that would bring about a dictatorship of the proletariat. Instead, they now wanted a peaceful revolution, which they thought would improve the living conditions of the working classes through democratic reforms. This is why the Marxist Socialist Party of Germany, the SPD, split into 3 factions in the winter of 1918 to 1919. You had the majority Social Democratic Party under Ebert, which wanted a peaceful revolution with democratic reforms. The Independent Social Democratic Party, the USPD, under Hugo Haase, which wanted a council or Soviet-style totalitarianism, but knew that the majority of the German people wanted democracy, and so they hesitated to implement their violent revolution. And then there were the communists in the Spartacus League, which later became the KPD. Led by Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, which wanted a violent revolution and a totalitarian dictatorship of the proletariat. And for ease of language, I'm going to refer to this as the socialist split. Of course, there are more socialist splits than just this. This is just the first major split that came along after the Russian Revolution. I've covered this particular split in more detail in the second video of my Still to Be Continued Weimar Hyperinflation series, so check out that video for more depth. But in a nutshell, thanks to the failure of socialism during the Russian Revolution, socialists across the world now didn't know what real socialism was. Unless you were a die-hard communist fanatic, socialism could no longer be seen as a violent revolution which would result in a totalitarian dictatorship of the proletariat. That wasn't real socialism anymore. The wonderful utopian vision we can imagine in our heads must be something else. We have neither used Russian methods nor are we pursuing Russian objectives. There is no Russian Bolshevism in Germany, with the exception of a few visionaries. Well, Hitler lived through this socialist split and had to deal with it himself. We have video and photographic evidence of Hitler marching in the funeral procession for the Jewish independent socialist revolutionary Kurt Eisner in 1919, the guy I've just quoted from. And it turns out that Hitler was elected into Kurt Eisner's Bavarian People's State, and then, after Eisner's socialist state collapsed, he was then elected again into a Bavarian Soviet Republic, which was communist. So let me make this clear. Hitler was an elected socialist and communist in early 1919. After the military defeat of the communist-organised Bavarian Soviet Republic in early May 1919, Hitler had taken off his red armband, turned against communism, and developed social democratic feelings. Hitler then lies about all this in Mein Kampf, pretending he had nothing to do with Kurt Eisner's government. But what's crucial to understand is that he's trying to paint the idea that he had, by this time, figured out the problem. He's basically saying he knows what caused the socialist split, and he has the solution. And what is his final solution? Well, he says he realised that the Jews were behind all the other socialist parties. And this wasn't a radical belief at the time, since many Bavarians shared this view. In addition to Kurt Eisner, a good number of the Moscow-funded communists and German Social Democrat leaders were Jews, a lot of whom were born in Russia. So Hitler concluded that these Jews owed their allegiance to a foreign power and were out to destroy Germany rather than save it. Then Hitler received anti-Bolshevik educational training from his unit commanders starting on the 5th of June 1919, which coincided with his abandonment of communism and his move towards social democracy. The situation in Munich could not last as it was. It tended irresistibly to a further extension of the revolution. Eisner's death served only to hasten this development and finally led to the dictatorship of the councils, or to put it more correctly, to a Jewish hegemony, which turned out to be transitory, but which was the original aim of those who had contrived the revolution. It may not be obvious without the context, but what Hitler has just done here is gotten around the socialist split. Rather than choosing between democracy or dictatorship, Hitler's just said that the Soviet-style totalitarianism implemented in Munich and in Russia was Jewish in nature, which is why he thinks it's failed. From Mein Kampf onwards, what Hitler wants is a version of socialism for the Aryan rather than the Jew, which doesn't totally destroy the economy like the Marxists did in Russia. In all countries, the consequences of the activities of the Jewish Bolshevik regime were chaos, misery, and famine. In contrast to that, I strove in the past 2 decades to achieve a new socialist order in Germany with a minimum of intervention and without destroying our production. A new socialist order that not only eliminated unemployment, but also increasingly let the profit from the work go to the working man. The successes of this policy, of a new economic and social order for our folk, the systematic overcoming of social differences and class distinctions, are unequalled in the world. Elsewhere, he put it more bluntly: German socialism is directed by Germans. International socialism is an instrument of the Jews. And throughout Mein Kampf and elsewhere, he argues that international socialism was a trick by the Jews to destroy the world, and even says the idea of class warfare was a Jewish invention. For Hitler, the dictatorship of the Aryan would not be the failure that the dictatorship of the Jews was. So it's no longer a question of dictatorship versus democracy or a question of class warfare, because Hitler knows what real socialism is. It's Aryan dictatorship. So it's not class war, it's race war. Democracy, as practiced in Western Europe today, is the forerunner of Marxism. In fact, the latter would not be conceivable without the former. Democracy is the breeding ground in which the bacilli of the Marxist world pest can grow and spread. Only a Jew can praise an institution which is as corrupt and false as himself. As a contrast to this kind of democracy, we have the German democracy, which is a true democracy, for here the leader is freely chosen and is obliged to accept full responsibility for all his actions and omissions. The problems to be dealt with are not put to the vote of the majority, but they are decided upon by the individual, and as a guarantee of responsibility for those decisions, he pledges all he has in the world and even his life. Now, it's important to note that Hitler wrote Mein Kampf after his 1923 putsch had failed. Prior to this, Hitler was all about violent revolution. He even resigned from the party in 1921 in protest to the idea that they should engage in parliamentary democracy, which is not the same democracy he wanted. In August 1923, he was quoted by The World newspaper from New York as saying what Germany needs is a revolution, not reform. Well, if we believe the standard narrative, Hitler's Munich Putsch was his attempt at a violent revolution. That violent revolution failed and landed him in prison, and he learnt his lesson that violent revolution does not work, and so, as he writes Mein Kampf, he says, all the previous revolutions had failed, that they weren't real revolutions, of course, and that the national revolution would have to be a legal, peaceful revolution. So let's just go back to the socialist split again. We have the majority socialists saying they want a peaceful revolution with parliamentary democracy. We have the independent socialists, which Hitler was a part of initially, saying they want totalitarianism, which they know needs a violent revolution, but they're not willing to do it. And the communists, who want a violent revolution and totalitarianism. Hitler comes along and, after failing in 1923, says he wants a peaceful revolution and totalitarianism, but caveats this by saying this new totalitarianism would be Aryan rather than Jewish, and therefore a good totalitarianism. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Hitler was originally part of the Independent Social Democratic Party. He's basically adopted their stance, with modifications to get around the initial problem. This is, in fact, a further indication that he was part of Kurt Eisner's movement, because he's rejected the stance of both the majority Social Democrats, the MSPD, and the Communists, the KPD, and has gone down a middle road, which is where the Independent Social Democrats resided when the socialist split originally occurred. Hitler was a member of this movement, added racism into the mix, and that's why he rejected both the SPD and KPD. He's between the two, both of which he paints as Jewish. He also says he's in the third position, which is true. He's in the third position between Jewish socialism and Jewish communism. Conrad Hayden also remarked that during this time, in heated discussions, Hitler had espoused the cause of social democracy against that of the communists. During his years as a correspondent for the Frankfurter Zeitung, Hayden wrote that Hitler had supported the SPD, Social Democratic Party of Germany, and he talked about joining the party. At an early meeting of a political group that eventually turned into the Nazi Party, Hitler told Friedrich Kron, an early supporter of the party, that he preferred a type of socialism he referred to as National Social Democracy that was not dissimilar to nations like Scandinavia, England, and pre-war Bavaria. One wonders if Stalin had it correct all along, that the Social Democrats and the Nazis were twins birthed by the same socialist mother. Why then did Hitler not join the Social Democrats? Because they signed the Treaty of Versailles on the 9th of July 1919. Prior to this moment, Hitler was very much in the social democracy camp, but this betrayal of Germany caused him to see the SPD as traitors of the race. So, let's just think about this for a second. Hitler was an independent social democrat and then a communist in early 1919. But when these movements collapsed, he started to receive anti-Bolshevik educational training from his unit commanders on the 5th of June 1919. He then abandons the independent socialists and communists and moves towards the majority social democrats. But they signed the Treaty of Versailles on the 9th of July 1919, which he sees as a betrayal of the German race. And it's during June and July 1919 that he starts to see both the Social Democrats and the Communists as Jewish movements. And it's probably at this time that his anti-Semitism really began. Less than 2 months after the signing of the Treaty of Versailles on the 12th of September 1919, Hitler attended his first meeting of the German Workers' Party, which later became the National Socialist German Workers' Party. And the first time we hear of Hitler's anti-Semitism is on the 16th of September 1919 in a written statement known as the Gemlich Letter. This was in response to another letter written on the 4th of September proving that Hitler had developed his anti-Semitism at the latest sometime in the summer of 1919 prior to him joining the party. The point of all this is to show that Hitler had been a communist and social democrat, but had abandoned both of them due to the events of 1919 and now believed that both of these movements were Jewish. Thus, the socialism he wanted was not the Jewish socialism that the SPD or KPD were talking about. Contrary to the accepted Marxist interpretation, Hitler was not an opponent of Marxism and did not want to destroy it because he was inimical to Labour, but because he was caught up in the insane idea that Marxism was an instrument of the Jews for the achievement of world domination, and above all because he rejected internationalism, pacifism, and the negation of the personality principle by Marxism. To Wagner, Hitler spoke about a way to socialism without overturn, without destruction of the most valuable property, without extinction of irreplaceable human lives, and without a relapse into a lower condition of civilization and culture, as well as the standard of living and even life itself. When Hitler told Wagner that the issue was to convert the German people to socialism without the destruction of property and values, without destruction of the culture and the morals and the ethics which set us Europeans apart from the Asiatics and from other races, then this reflected fear so typical in the German tradition of too radical, uncontrolled and chaotic revolutionary changes. Then, on the day of Hitler's seizure of power, he said this to Hans Frank: "That was the most unbloody revolution in history." Hermann Goering later said that soon after Hitler's appointment, it was necessary to create concentration camps, particularly for communists and some social democrats. Though he admitted that in the beginning there was some brutality, he claimed that theirs was the least bloody and most disciplined of all the revolutions in history. How important it was for Hitler to stress the orderly, unbloody and disciplined character of the National Socialist Revolution can be deduced from the fact that even in his speech of 30th of January 1944, on the 11th anniversary of his seizure of power, Hitler still points out that a socialist revolution had taken place in Germany without any destruction of property. And there are numerous quotes from him describing this peaceful revolutionary triumph, which, for the sake of brevity, I won't bore you with. What is worth pointing out, though, is that Hitler's change of stance does not mean that he was no longer a revolutionary. We can find several statements from Hitler himself saying that he didn't care for elections or parliaments, and that he was only going this route because the circumstances dictated it. And it's this stance that led to the split with Gregor Strasser, and Hitler himself doubted on occasion whether this method was the correct one. Nonetheless, he stuck with it, and ultimately it would pay off for him. It also doesn't mean that he's not a socialist. Yes, he's not a Marxist socialist, but he is a national socialist. He's aiming to build a German socialism which doesn't destroy Germany in the process like Lenin did to the Russians. And I need to emphasize this because a lot of people get confused by this, as did a lot of people in his own party. Many within the party, and especially the SA, were still calling for a Marxist style of socialism. They wanted a revolution where the means of production were violently stolen from the owners, and where everything was centrally planned from the very beginning, an overnight change. The problem was that this style of socialism would destroy Germany, just like it did to Russia, China, Cambodia, Venezuela, North Korea, the whole of Eastern Europe, in fact everywhere that socialism has ever been tried. So Hitler says, no. They're going to implement a non-violent revolution which brings about totalitarian socialism via reform, one step at a time. So you may now be beginning to see why Hitler broke with Ernst Röhm. Interestingly enough, Röhm joined the DAP, the German Workers' Party, a month after Hitler had. At this time he was a captain in the German army, which is why he was scarred. His nose had been shot off in combat against the French in 1914. After the war, he was outraged by what he saw in post-revolutionary Germany. Workers' and soldiers' councils after the Russian Jewish model had been set up under the flag of the revolution, both in Germany proper and the Etappe, the area between the German border and the front. Anyone reading Röhm's memoirs has to be struck by his anti-Marxian version of socialism, and his belief that the revolutions at war's end had unfortunately given socialism a bad name. Romm's anti-Semitism was remarkably similar to Hitler's. He wanted to root out the disease of the internationalist pacifist contamination, which he said controlled the stock exchange and was driving the working class into the hands of the Marxists and the Jewish leaders, and then stealing German property for themselves. Fighting against the Jews, Romm wrote a piece where he styled himself as the saviour of the fatherland. And after protesting and challenging Eisner's councils, Romm joined Colonel Franz Ritter von Epp's Freikorps in Bavaria, which then stood up to the riffraff and scum of the Bavarian Soviet Republic, which they destroyed in May 1919. In other words, Romm fought against the government that Hitler had been elected into. This is another reason why Hitler didn't mention that he had been elected into these Judeo-Marxist governments in Mein Kampf, because that would have been a great source of embarrassment for him. Like many early National Socialists, Ernst Röhm was a homosexual, and as Richard Evans describes in his book The Coming of the Third Reich, Ernst Röhm was an incredibly violent individual who liked violence for the sake of violence. It made sense then that he was placed in charge of the SA, the Sturmabteilung, or the Assault Division, because this was the organisation where the stormtroopers came from. Röhm had no interest at all in ideas, and glorified the rough and brutal lifestyle of the soldier in his acts as well as his creed. He had nothing but contempt for civilians, and revelled in the lawlessness of wartime life. Drinking and carousing, fighting and brawling cemented the band of brothers among whom he found his place. Women were treated with disdain. Strangers to the military life had no place in his world. Many of the SA were from the working class and the unemployed. And many were also communists. In fact, many National Socialists were swapping back and forth between the Communists, the Social Democrats, and the National Socialists, which is where the terms beefsteaks or beefsteak Nazis came from. Brown on the outside, red on the inside. Rudolf Diels, head of the Gestapo in 1933 and 1934, estimated that 70% of SA recruits were former communists, and another political scientist estimated it was actually 77%, and that 63% of the SS were former communists as well. Interestingly, Marxist author Paul Caradis then says the SS were predominantly members of the middle class, which begs the question, is communism a middle-class movement? Since Nazi and communist ideology and tactics appeared similar to so many, especially the working class, side-switching between Nazis and communists became increasingly popular, especially inside SA ranks. The Nazis encouraged German communists to join them, regarding them as excellent new recruits. Of course, the communists did the same, since their ideological makeup was so interchangeable. In the early days of the movement, having the SA made sense. The National Socialists were fighting the communists and other socialists in the streets, they were smashing up Jewish shops, and these guys were a core component of the violent revolutionary attempt in 1923. But once this attempt fails, and Hitler swaps his stance towards a peaceful revolution, the role of the SA came into question. The failed putsch also taught him that he would not even be able to take the first step, the acquisition of supreme power in Germany itself, by relying on paramilitary violence alone. A march on Rome was out of the question in Germany. It was essential to win mass public support. The revolutionary conquest of power, still favoured by Röhm, would not work in any case if it was undertaken without the support of the army, so conspicuously lacking in November 1923. Coming to power clearly required collaboration from key elements in the establishment, and although he had enjoyed some support in 1923, it had not proved sufficient. In the next crisis, which was to occur less than a decade later, he made sure he had the army and the key institutions of the state either neutralised or actively working for him, unlike in 1923. Röhm and the SA were never unconditionally loyal to Hitler. Evans describes how they were somewhat a separate organisation within the wider National Socialist movement. In fact, Röhm actually broke ties with Hitler and resigned from the party on the 1st of May 1925 after a disagreement regarding the merging of the SA with the Frontbahn. And Röhm only returned in 1930 when Hitler asked him to do so. Pfeffer agreed that the SA should not be the paramilitary force that Ernst Röhm had wanted before he resigned as its head. Toward the end of 1930, Hitler appealed to Röhm to return and take over again the leadership of the SA, which was getting out of hand. Its members, even its leaders, apparently believed in a coming Nazi revolution by violence, and with increasing frequency they were taken to the streets. I think it's interesting that Röhm was brought back to stabilise the SA and prevent it from implementing a violent revolution, only for Hitler to then purge Ernst Röhm later. It's just interesting. But the unloyalty of the SA is why, in 1925, Hitler formed a personal bodyguard unit under Julius Schreck, which became the SS, the Schutzstaffel. Himmler took over in January 1929, and the SS became an elite internal police formation of loyal National Socialists, seemingly operating within the SA, but actually loyal to Hitler rather than to Röhm. And there's an interesting incident that occurred in 1930 which I think highlights the overall problem perfectly. Within the context of the time, Hitler was trying to hide the socialist program of the party to get more people to vote for him. We have a significant amount of evidence for this, including the fact that he confided to Otto Wagner at the time, quoted earlier, that he believed that the socialist worldview was replacing the individualistic one. But during the election in September 1930, one SA leader, Walter Stennes, stormed the party's headquarters in Berlin with some of his comrades. They demanded that the party pay attention to the original socialist ideology that it had started with. Hitler deposed of Stennes in March 1931, but the unruly Stennes briefly led a breakaway group of SA men, claiming to return to the original Nazi program as a revolutionary, not a parliamentary movement. He attempted to establish a more socialist-sounding program, though his small group was itself divided on key issues. This shows the tension between the two different styles of revolution, the old classic violent revolution which Röhm and Stennes wanted, and the new peaceful and parliamentary revolution that Hitler wanted. Remember that no revolution had ever been done peacefully before, so Hitler was doing something completely new here, and the revolutionaries just weren't used to this. And in order to get elected, Hitler had to hide his more radical side from the public, which people misinterpret to mean that he had abandoned his socialism, when in fact he was just masking it. And almost immediately after the seizure of power, Hitler's stance towards Röhm and the SA changed. Implementing the totalitarian state that Hitler called for from the beginning, the SA and Nazi Party members marched into the businesses and took them over from within, functionally nationalising everything under the policy of Gleichschaltung, synchronisation. For example, on the 6th of April 1933, the SA broke into the headquarters building of the Reichsbahn, the state railways, and confronted Alfred Beyer, demanding that the entire board of directors be dismissed, along with the Jews, Social Democrats, and Freemasons, and there were more demands beside this. The middle class and its representative organisations were caught in the crosshairs of the National Socialist League of Struggle for the Commercial Middle Class, which, beginning in March 1933, organised boycotts of department stores, consumer cooperatives and corporations, and forced the heads of associations to step down, thus gaining control of the retail and trade sectors. It took some time, but everything in the Reich was eventually socialised into the state, from the media, the economy, the schools, the trade unions, the police, and every single social establishment, from the youth organisations to the yacht clubs. We must get every available position of power into our hands, so that the National Socialist movement will become the state. Between the 30th of January and 14th of July 1933, the Nazis had coordinated all social institutions, apart from the churches and the army, into a vast and still inchoate structure run by themselves. They had purged huge swaths of culture and the arts, the universities and the education system, and almost every other area of German society of everyone who was opposed to them. Its gigantic scale and its absolute comprehensiveness are not the products merely of an idle interest in organisation, but of a measure of necessity. Nothing in the whole machinery is there for its own sake. They aimed for the complete coordination with the movement of all existing organisations, down to those of the canary breeders and the stamp collectors. It would be an altogether superficial view to regard all this as the mere outcome of personal ambition. In order to assure its power, National Socialism could not afford to leave in freedom even the most insignificant zone, even an entirely unpolitical one. I'm emphasising this because so many people refuse to accept the facts. Everything was functionally socialised into the state under the policy of Gleichschaltung. Some of these sources refer to Gleichschaltung as coordination, but as discussed in a previous video, the more accurate translation in English is synchronisation. Everything was in the process of being socialised. But this wasn't the same style of socialisation that had occurred in Russia because it wasn't a violent revolution. Well, in the aftermath of this peaceful national revolution, the SA continued to be violent. The SA men, most of whom had been recruited from the army of the desperate unemployed by Hitler's promises of salvation, were eager to enjoy the fruits of victory without delay. The strategy of undermining and penetrating the state apparatus through administrative and legislative acts was not their idea of seizure of power and revolution. They were out for booty. They wanted to be taken care of with jobs and sinecures. As the economy improved, it was hoped that the problem of the unemployed SA would solve itself. Unfortunately, the economy wasn't recovering fast enough, and the SA now had no outlets for its violence. The communists had been crushed, with many being converted to Nazis themselves, and the population either now supported the National Socialists or was silenced. So there were no obvious enemies to attack apart from the Jews, and violence was the name of the game for the SA. They were now running about beating up innocent people and also the police when they tried to stop them. This violence may have made sense prior to Hitler's seizure of power, because it was an embarrassment to the ineffectual authorities who couldn't deal with the SA. But now that Hitler was in power, that embarrassment fell upon him and his state, since they weren't dealing with the problem either. The continuing instability not only made a large number of people fearful of what would happen next, but it also discouraged economic activity. Political pressure from the Reich Economic Ministry and the Justice Ministry, among others, were putting pressure on Hitler to do something about this. And while Hitler had gained power via a peaceful revolution, in the ranks of the SA and the party in general, there was talk of a second revolution, a violent revolution. This was because Ernst Röhm himself was delivering speeches and articles calling for a second revolution. In fact, he coined the term. Hitler was beginning to be concerned about the power that the rampages of the ever-expanding SA gave to its leader Ernst Röhm, who had declared on the 30th of May 1933 that its task of completing the National Socialist Revolution still lies before it. Whether declarations of loyalty come every day from coordinated beekeeping or bowling clubs makes no odds, nor whether a town's streets get up-to-date names. One victory on the road of German revolution has been won. The SA and SS, who bear the great responsibility of having set the German revolution rolling, will not allow it to be betrayed at the halfway mark. If the Philistines believe that the national revolution has lasted too long, it is indeed high time that the national revolution should end and become a national socialist one. We shall continue our fight, with them or without them, and if necessary, against them. We are the incorruptible guarantors of the fulfillment of the German Revolution. There are still men in official positions today who have not the least idea of the spirit of the revolution. We shall ruthlessly get rid of them if they dare to put their reactionary ideas into practice. And he wasn't the only one demanding a second revolution, as Goebbels wrote this in his diary. Everyone among the people is talking of a second revolution, which must come. That means that the first revolution is not at an end. Now we shall settle with the reaction. The revolution must nowhere come to a halt. Well, it turns out that Hitler didn't want a second revolution, partly because stabilising the economy was now his priority, but also because that would mean that he himself would be toppled. Hitler wants to remain in power, and so he's against this second revolutionary idea. This doesn't mean that he was a reactionary in the Marxist sense, or that his socialist rhetoric was merely propaganda, as Scheirer and the Marxists claim. He's in the process of completing his own peaceful revolution at this point, when Röhm is demanding a violent second revolution. So, both could be classed as revolutionaries and reactionaries, depending on the perspective. And in reality, what this all comes down to is merely a clash of styles. The socio-revolutionary dynamism of the SA clashed with Hitler's tactic of the slow completion of the total state, and Röhm made him increasingly aware of this. In April 1934, he criticised Hitler's incomprehensible leniency towards reactionaries and his failure to have cleaned house ruthlessly. After Hitler gained power, there was a flood of opportunists who wanted to join the National Socialist Party, and so the party had to ban new members from joining in May 1933, fearing that they weren't really committed to the cause. While unable to join the Nazi Party, they instead joined its other organisations, including the SA, swelling the ranks and causing a further split between the party and the SA. So it's not as clear-cut as Röhm was making it out to be. The SA had also been lenient on reactionary elements, the thing that Röhm was accusing Hitler of. But what was perhaps the final straw was Röhm's insistence that the SA should be turned into a paramilitary force, and that it should then replace the traditional army. He wanted the SA to become the Reichsmilitia Army, and he said that they would do away with the traditional imperial army of the Reichswehr. Röhm wanted to use the SA as a huge militia base for a thoroughly rearmed Germany organised along more or less national Bolshevist lines. To Röhm, the SA was the nucleus of the future revolutionary army, which would be for Hitler what the French conscript armies were to Napoleon after the French Revolution. But Hitler was certain that only the officer corps, with all its martial traditions and abilities, could achieve his goal of building up in a short space of time a strong, disciplined armed force. The SA was but a mob, good enough for street fighting but of little worth as a modern army. Rearmament was too serious and difficult a business to permit the participation of peculators, drunkards, and homosexuals. Tensions between the SA and the military had been building since the summer of 1933, which is also when Hitler began the rearmament program. But it was in January 1934 when things really heated up. The SA broke into the Hotel Kaiserhof in Berlin to disrupt a celebration of the Kaiser's birthday held by a bunch of army officers. On the 1st of February, Röhm sent General Blomberg a memorandum demanding that the army be replaced by the SA. And as you can imagine, the German Army Officer Corps was not happy. Acting on his own initiative, General Blomberg got rid of the Jews from the army, although only a few were actually removed at this time because President Hindenburg intervened, and Blomberg incorporated the swastika into the army's insignia. This and other measures were done to show Hitler that the army was actually loyal to him. Having made these moves, the leadership then appealed to Hitler directly. On the 28th of February 1934, a meeting was held between Blomberg, Hitler, the SA, and the SS, where Röhm was forced to sign an agreement that said the army would not be replaced by the SA. After the army officers had left the following reception, Röhm told his men that he was not going to obey the ridiculous corporal and threatened to send Hitler on leave. Such insubordination did not go unnoticed. Indeed, aware of his attitude, Hitler had already put him under covert surveillance by the police. Hitler told Anthony Eden in private that he was willing to reduce the SA by 2/3 and was prepared to set up a system of inspection to make sure that the SA wasn't receiving arms or military training. When this information got leaked, Röhm and the SA were not happy. But, words aside, Hitler hesitated to actually take on Röhm in a head-on clash. As tensions mounted, it was Rudolf Hess, head of the NSDAP's political organisation, who started to prepare the party for a conflict with the SA. And by the summer of 1934, Hitler was dealing with a wane in popularity. Cries for a second revolution were growing throughout Germany, and this is where there's a nice contradiction in the sources. William Shirer, in his The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, says that Goebbels, whom he's already painted as a real socialist, joined in with the cries for a second revolution. But Orlo, in his History of the Nazi Party, says Hitler felt like he couldn't stand by and do nothing, and so allowed Goebbels to start a propaganda campaign against critics and spoilers of the regime. Well, I don't know which is true, but it highlights the fact that one or both of these old history books have misinterpreted the events. Regardless, the Conservatives under von Papen did begin to make speeches against this so-called Second Revolution, as well as against Hitler's regime as a whole. As you can imagine, Hitler was furious, interpreting this as a signal that the Conservatives were attempting to build a second front against him and the regime, and so he now wanted to act to stop both the Conservatives and the unloyal elements within the Reich. Goebbels tried to suppress Papen's speeches, searching his office 3 times, arresting Dr. Edgar Jung, the man who had composed the Marburg speech Papen delivered on the 17th of June 1934, and even attacked the Catholic press, which was printing the speech in brochure form. But Goebbels was unsuccessful, especially with the Marburg speech, which the public were in agreement with. Now, in the books I used for this video, I only had snippets of Papen's speech, and when I went online to find the full text, the only source in English I could find was Wikipedia. I knew Wikipedia was incorrect because the snippets I had said Papen used a train metaphor, whereas Wikipedia said he used a boat metaphor. So I thought I'd better verify this. I therefore made a post about it, and several German-speaking viewers came back with translations of this part of the speech, and I was tempted to use one of these here. I was also tempted to use an English book that one of my viewers found which had the full speech quoted, and comparing that to the other translations from my viewers, it's alright, but a lot of people were linking to the translation on the R-Plan website, which seems to have done the best job overall. So thank you to everyone who helped verify this, and without further ado, here is the most accurate translation of the speech we have. No folk can afford a constant revolt from below if it wants to stand the test of history. Someday the movement must come to an end. Someday a solid social structure must emerge, held together by an impartial judiciary and by an undisputed state authority. It cannot be formed with eternal dynamism. Germany must not become a train speeding off into the blue with nobody knowing when it will stop. History flows by itself. It is not necessary to drive it on incessantly. If, therefore, the German Revolution should experience a second wave of new life, it will be not as a social revolution, but as the creative culmination of work already begun. Goering responded with his own speech the next day, which at the time seemed to be addressed to Papen, but it was later realised that this wasn't the case. It was actually aimed at Röhm. The application of new, perhaps radical revolutionary methods would hardly bring an improvement. It is not our business to determine whether a second revolution is necessary. The first revolution was ordered by the Führer. If the Führer wants a second revolution, we shall be ready in the streets tomorrow. If he does not want it, we shall suppress anybody who tries to make one against the Führer's will. Goebbels also made a speech. The enemies of National Socialism sit not among the workers, but among the fine gentlemen, among those who see in our movement only a passing phenomenon. When the revolution broke out, they came over to our side with flying colours, but when they saw that we did not receive them with open arms, they retreated into their lairs. No one must believe that our enemies have crept into their rat holes forever. They sit inside them, but they are waiting for their hour to come. Himmler, head of the SS and now the Gestapo, as well as Goering, who had been made a general in the army, had turned against Ernst Röhm and began setting up their own bodyguards and paramilitary forces as rumours of plots and counterplots started to spread. Both Goering and Himmler wanted to not only do away with the SA to strengthen their own positions, but also to settle scores with the Conservatives and other reactionaries in order to solidify the National Socialist position. Former Chancellors Brüning and Schleicher were warned in May 1934 that both of them were in danger of being murdered. Brüning smartly fled the country, while Schleicher went on vacation to Bavaria, but then returned to Berlin at the end of June, sealing his fate. Hitler spoke to Röhm one last time in early June, hoping to solve the crisis. We don't know exactly what was said, but the bottom line is that nothing was solved, and Hitler ordered that the SA had to go on leave for the entire month of July. Röhm himself went on sick leave on the 7th of June 1934, and the SA were prohibited from wearing their uniforms. All of this, and more clues besides, should have indicated that their days were numbered, but it seems that none of them put two and two together. Rudolf Hess even gave a speech on the 25th of June, trying desperately to get the SA to back down in what was a last-ditch effort to prevent the situation from boiling over. It also served as a warning. Maybe Adolf Hitler will one day find it necessary to again move developments forward by revolutionary means, but this can always only be a revolution that he directs. Adolf Hitler is a revolutionary in the grand style, and will inwardly remain a revolutionary in the grand style. He does not need any crutches. Adolf Hitler is the greatest strategist of revolution. Woe be unto him who, in the delusion that he could do it more quickly, clumsily tramples about between the finely spun threads of his strategic plans. He is an enemy of the revolution. And remember before when we said that Hitler had learned from the Munich Putsch in 1923 that he had to have support from the institutions and the army in order for him to be in power? Well, it was looking like he had lost that support and was about to be toppled. As tensions rose, the army was put on full alert on the 25th or 27th of June 1934, the sources vary, and Hitler learned that von Papen was about to speak to Hindenburg on the 30th, which convinced Hitler that he had to act. Hitler's mind was made up when, on the 21st of June 1934, he was told by Blomberg that if he did not bring the SA under control, President Hindenburg, who was displeased with Hitler's handling of the SA, would declare martial law and put the government in the hands of the army. Hitler would be thrown out of office if he didn't do something immediately. Therefore, he called Röhm's adjutant and ordered that the SA leadership should meet with him on the 30th of June. The date for the purge was therefore set. Fantastic rumours began to circulate, and the SA itself began to be alarmed. Some 3,000 stormtroopers rampaged through the streets of Munich on the night of the 29th of June, shouting that they would crush any attempt to betray their organisation and denouncing the leader and the army. There probably wasn't a combined plot by the Conservatives and Röhm to overthrow Hitler. More likely there were two or more factions, and the idea that there was a grand conspiracy was probably invented by Hitler to win over Goebbels, who was unsure which side to back until convinced by Hitler the night before the purge. Nonetheless, Hitler genuinely feared that he was about to be toppled by either an SA second revolution, a violent revolution, or by a second conservative revolution led by Papen, Hindenburg and the army. And he didn't want his peaceful revolution to be usurped by Röhm or stopped by a bunch of reactionaries. So, on the 30th of June 1934, Hitler ordered the planned purge to commence. After personally arresting the leaders of the previous night's march, Hitler and the SS drove in 3 cars to the Hanselbauer Hotel in Munich, where they found the leaders of the SA still sleeping after a drinking binge the night before. So far did the SA chiefs seem from staging a revolt that Röhm had left his staff guards in Munich. There appeared to be plenty of carousing among the SA leaders, but no plotting. Ernst Röhm's deputy, Edmund Heinz, was allegedly found in bed with an 18-year-old male SA troop leader, which was later made a big deal of. And Hitler entered Ernst Röhm's room alone with a whip. Yep, you can't make this up. And he declared that he was being arrested. The SA leaders were taken to the Nazi Party headquarters, where Hitler ranted at them, accusing them of conspiracy against the state and being in the pay of the French. Rudolf Hess volunteered to shoot them personally and entered an argument with Max Amann for the privilege. Instead, Röhm was briefly imprisoned, and on the 1st of July was visited by Theodor Eicke, Commandant of Dachau, and Michael Lippert, an SS adjutant, who gave Röhm an American Browning pistol with one bullet in the chamber. Hitler was giving Röhm the opportunity to end his own life, but Röhm refused to do so. The SS men gave him 10 minutes alone to pull the trigger, but when they re-entered the room, they found Röhm standing with his bare chest puffed out in a gesture of defiance and loyalty. So Eicke and Lippert took out their own guns and shot Röhm at point-blank range, killing him immediately. Edmund Heinz was executed, as was von Pappen's secretary Herbert von Bose, and his other associate Edgar Jung, the one who had written the Marburg speech. These were conservatives, by the way. Another right-winger and former Chancellor, General Kurt von Schleicher, who I mentioned before, and his wife were shot at their home. Schleicher was the last Chancellor before Hitler, and wasn't the only general to be killed. Major General Kurt von Bredau was also killed at his home. Apart from anything else, these killings served as a warning to the army leadership that they too would have to face the consequences if they did not toe the Nazi line. The former police chief and leader of Catholic Action, Erich Klausner, now a senior civil servant in the Transport Ministry, was shot down on Heydrich's orders as a warning to another former Chancellor, Heinrich Brüning, who had been tipped off about the purge and had left the country. Klausner's murder sent a clear message to Catholics that a revival of independent Catholic political activity would not be tolerated. None of these men were involved with Röhm. They were killed because it was thought that they might form a possible future government. Gregor Strasser, who had sided with Schleicher, was a personal enemy of Himmler and Göring, and it was thought that Strasser might also side with the Conservatives in a future government, so he was shot as well. Von Papen himself was not shot, as he had Hindenburg's favour and was guarded by the Reichswehr on the day of the purge itself. But his office was ransacked and his staff, including his secretaries, were either shot or carted off to the concentration camps. Papen protested to Göring and then met with Hitler, who placed Papen under house arrest. His villa was surrounded by SS, the telephone wires were cut, and he was forbidden from having contact with the outside world. Captain Hermann Erhard, another right-wing leader who had opposed Hitler during the Munich Putsch in 1923 and who had sided with Strasser and others, was targeted but managed to flee to Austria as the police entered his home. Numerous other brown shirts and others were arrested and shot, including these so-called right-wingers, one of whom was a former SS member, and a handful of Jews were killed as well. In Munich, the brown shirts were the principal target. In Berlin, the Conservatives. In total, at least 85 people have been killed and thousands arrested. The death toll is sometimes listed as higher than this, with some speculating that perhaps 100 or maybe 200 people lost their lives. The problem is that these higher numbers are coming from foreign newspapers at the time, some of which were naming people that they thought had been killed but who actually hadn't been killed. In fact, one of the victims listed was one of the murderers. So some books, especially the communist sources I have, like Sewell's and Shirer's, just run with these and say that 1,000 people died. And to be fair, this number was also given at the Munich trial in 1957, but that doesn't mean it's right. 1,000 is multiple times the actual number, which is probably just 85 or maybe 100. Goebbels was quick to justify the action by saying that public order had been restored rather than undermined, and that a second revolution supported by the French had been stopped. Hitler said that 4 groups had been involved: communist street fighters who had infiltrated the SA, political opposition leaders, elements who believed in a permanent revolution, and upper-class conspiracists. Germany underwent a period of severe suppression until early August, with people arrested for even speaking out against the action, and rumour-mongers were also sent to the concentration camps. But this didn't stop people speculating that there was more to this than they were being told. I almost feel pity for Hitler as a human being. The man is lost and feels it. For the first time, he is speaking without hope. He does not think he is a murderer. In fact, he presumably did act in self-defense and prevented a substantially worse slaughter. But after all, he appointed these people to their posts. But after all, he is the author of this absolutist system. The dreadful thing is that a European nation has delivered itself up to such a gang of lunatics and criminals and still puts up with them. The SS, which had originally been part of the SA, now broke away in the aftermath of the Night of the Long Knives. Under Himmler's leadership, the SS became a state within a state, with its own police, and eventually getting its own military force. Hess and the party leadership were also strengthened with the removal of Röhm, and thousands left the SA after this point, with the organisation standing at 2.9 million members in August 1934, dropping to 1.6 million in October 1935, and then to 1.2 million in April 1938. The SA continued to operate until 1945, but was a mere shadow of what it had once been. The army, from Blomberg down to Lieutenant Klaus von Stauffenberg, who would later take part in the bomb plot of July 1944, all celebrated the Röhm Purge. Not long after, on the 2nd of August 1934, President Hindenburg died. Hitler merged the offices of President and Chancellor together, the army swore an oath to him, and after a bit more consolidation, Hitler's power became absolute. The Röhm Putsch and the passing of Hindenburg represented the death of the final real opposition to Hitler's regime. So, now that we know the context, we've seen the evidence, and understand the motivations behind the killing of Ernst Röhm, it should now be clear why the old Marxist narrative doesn't really work. I have a few of the Marxist texts, Scherer, Sewell, Carradis, etc., and while some are better than others, they're all awful. In fact, in the process of making this video, I had intended to cite their sources more, but I realised that I was just wasting my time. Their own citations are non-existent or few and far between. Sewell, for example, only cites his sources when he's quoting from them, so all the stuff in between the quotes is just not backed up at all. And the reason why they don't cite their sources is because, if they had to, they would quickly find that there's no basis in reality for the stuff they're saying. The evidence they do have is pathetic, or directly contradicted by other sources that they've used. So me citing them would be to cite bad sources myself, which is why I stopped. For example, in his book on the Night of the Long Knives, Phil Carradis has used 17 books, and a few more other sources. I've used 20 books in this video. That's right, I've used more books than a published author has. And remember, this is just a YouTube video, and this is not a real source. Yet, this not a real source has more evidence backing it up than a published book, which is also longer in length. He's got more words in his book than I have in this video, yet he's used fewer sources, indicating just how poor the quality of his work is. And again, unlike this video, he's got no citations. I've got no idea where he's getting half of his nonsense from, and unlike my books, a lot of his sources are not actually relevant to the topic, and in one case, he's used a picture book. His sources include fantastic newspapers like The Guardian, The New York Times, and The Wall Street Journal, none of which are German, and none of which have directly witnessed the events in question. He's also used the BBC, You know, the British equivalent to Goebbels' state-funded propaganda ministry. And as I've shown in a recent video, newspapers are some of the worst sources you could possibly use anyway. And then on top of all this, he lists Wikipedia and the Marxist website SpartacusEducational.com in his bibliography. I think it's telling when a not a real source YouTube video does a better job at history than a traditionally published book. Yes, Sewell's book has more sources, but it also covers a much wider period than the Ernst Röhm Putsch, and the amount of sources he's used for the entire period is also not that many. Again, an indication of the poor quality. And really, the Marxist narrative is just as bad as their lack of sources. It relies entirely upon your ignorance. In a nutshell, Caradis, Shirer, Sewell, and many other historians in the past have oversimplified the narrative to paint Röhm as a left-wing, socialist, revolutionary, and Hitler as a far-right capitalist reactionary in the pay of the big industrial capitalists. They repeat these claims, usually without any sources to back them up, because it's just Marxist propaganda, and I've already explained why Hitler wasn't funded into power by the capitalists in a previous video, and I've also shown numerous times now that he synchronized the industries rather than privatized them, as the Marxists claim. But, as I said, this narrative preys upon the ignorance of the casual reader of history, which is why so many have fallen for it. But since I've now shown you the evidence regarding Röhm, it becomes clear that this hasn't got anything to do with capitalism versus socialism, or revolution versus counter-revolution, or left versus right. It's violent revolution versus peaceful revolution. It's one version of socialism versus another version of socialism. And German historian Rainer Zitelmann clarifies this perfectly. The conflict between Hitler and Röhm was not a conflict between reaction and revolution, but more between the representatives of different models of revolution. The historian H. Mao probably gave the clearest description by saying that the conflict was between a revolutionary of the old school, Röhm, and a representative of modern revolution, Hitler. Hitler's was the first revolution that was mainly peaceful. Hitler's was the first revolution to attempt to seize the means of production without a violent overthrow of the previous order. The Nazis took over everything, they synchronized everything in with the state, peacefully, rather than burning everything to the ground like the Bolsheviks had done in Russia. And perhaps it's this lack of violence that has confused so many people, and maybe Marxism requires a violent overthrow, but other versions of socialism, including social democracy, British Fabian socialism, Christian socialism, and German National Socialism, don't require a violent revolution. And as far as we're concerned, Marxism doesn't have a monopoly on what socialism is. Now, there are a few other ideas we need to address. It is true that once Hitler got into power, he started to say that his revolution was at an end. And so it is possible to find individual statements from Hitler where he says that the revolution is over and then use that to paint him as a reactionary. This is what the old Marxist historians did and the new ones are still trying to do. The problem is that Hitler was all for revolution in the period before 1933 and also in the period after Röhm. Hitler only toned down his revolutionary rhetoric for the period of roughly 1933 to 34 to deal with Röhm and stop a second violent revolution. Once he's done that, and once he's consolidated power, he starts to slide back into his usual revolutionary rhetoric, either through sheer ignorance, incompetence, or by wearing their Marxist glasses. The old historians and the modern ideologues have actually fallen for Hitler's propaganda. Another argument is that Ernst Röhm was a socialist. Hitler killed Ernst Röhm, therefore Hitler's not a socialist. Okay, Ernst Röhm is also a Nazi. Hitler killed Ernst Röhm, so Hitler's not a Nazi? Ernst Röhm is a World War I veteran, and Hitler killed Ernst Röhm, so Hitler's not a World War I veteran. Ernst Röhm is a man, and Hitler killed Ernst Röhm, so Hitler's not a man. I hope some of you are beginning to see how stupid this argument actually is. Also, why would Stalin kill socialists? Why would Lenin kill socialists? Why would communists kill social democrats and vice versa? Is it because they're not real socialists? No, it's simply because they're competing variants of socialism. Socialists can't even agree on what the definition of socialism is, so if there's no universal definition of socialism, it's no wonder that they're all killing each other. They say that Hitler purged the left-wing socialist elements from his party. But he didn't purge the party, he only purged the SA and then only killed about 85 of them with 1,000 or so more people put in the camps. 2.9 million more socialists, many former communists, continue to operate in the SA after this point, or in the ranks of the party as people left the SA. Why were they not purged? Why did he allow 2.9 million socialists to continue to exist? Also, the SS, Hitler's own bodyguard, had been part of the Socialist SA, and continued to exist after the purge. If Hitler was a capitalist, why would he have a socialist bodyguard, and then expand this to be its own police state and army? Besides, Hitler didn't just target the SA, he targeted the conservatives, who are traditionally seen as right-wing, even though they're not. They're also seen as the capitalists who supposedly funded Hitler into power, yet they were all purged as well. In light of the fact that Hitler killed conservatives, right-wingers, classic liberals, and even some former SS members, the Marxist narrative crumbles into dust, which is why this fact is usually overlooked and forgotten in the Marxist narrative. What's also forgotten is the socialist split and the varying types of socialist revolution. Violent or peaceful, reform or dictatorship, national or international. There's no mention of this in any of their books, apart from Sewell's, because he has no choice but to bring it up due to the time period he's covering. But even then, he excuses this by saying the SPD had fallen to conservatism. That's right, the Socialist Democratic Party of Germany, the one the communists were in until 1919, is now classed as conservative. And the reason why Sewell and the Marxists have had to distort history like this is because socialism is perfect. There are no flaws, no splits, no mass starvation. And any splits or mass starvation that may exist are a figment of your bourgeois imagination, or a byproduct of the fact that you don't know what real socialism is. It's definitely not because socialism is a race to the bottom or anything. There are more arguments, and I would love to sit here and go through each one of them in turn, but this video is already way too long, and it's not worth it because they're not listening to reason anyway. But if you have listened, and then you do come across these arguments, it should be obvious why these arguments don't work. What I will point out, though, is that you can find people on Quora asking questions like, did Hitler have Ernst Röhm executed because he was gay? Or was Ernst Röhm killed for being LGBT? Thankfully, the answers are all saying no, which means, for once, I'm not going against the grain when I confirm that Ernst Röhm was not killed for being gay. The homosexual angle may have been used in the propaganda after the killings, but it wasn't a motivation for the purge itself. In conclusion then, Hitler killed Ernst Röhm because Hitler's peaceful revolution was being threatened by a second violent revolution, either from the SA or the Conservatives and the army. It had nothing to do with capitalism versus socialism or any of the other nonsense coming from the Marxist sources. And if you still doubt Hitler's socialism or think that Hitler was funded into power by the capitalists, go ahead and check out my other videos on these topics. I have an entire playlist now dedicated to crushing the old narratives that keep being pushed. So fill your boots. Thanks for watching, bye for now.